For decades, a persistent belief has circulated both within Igbo communities in southeastern Nigeria and across parts of the wider diaspora, the idea that the Igbo people are a lost tribe of Israel, descendants of ancient Hebrews who somehow migrated across an entire continent and settled in West Africa thousands of years ago. It's a belief tied to genuine cultural practices, certain religious customs, and oral traditions that do bear surface resemblance to elements of ancient Israelite tradition. When geneticists actually sequenced the DNA of Igbo populations and traced their genetic lineage back through tens of thousands of years, what they found wasn't a hidden thread connecting West Africa to the ancient Near East. It was something considerably older, considerably more rooted, and in its own way, more remarkable, evidence of one of the deepest, most continuous indigenous population histories documented anywhere on the African continent. To understand what the actual genetic evidence shows, you first have to understand who the Igbo people are and where they live today. The Igbo are one of Nigeria's largest ethnic groups, numbering somewhere in the range of 30 to 40 million people, concentrated primarily in southeastern Nigeria, across states including Anambra, Enugu, Imo, Abia, and Ebonyi, a region collectively known as Igbo land. Igbo society has historically been organized in a way that distinguishes it from many neighboring West African kingdoms, built around decentralized governance structures rather than centralized monarchy, relying instead on councils of elders, age-grade associations, and village-level assemblies to manage community affairs. This particular social structure matters for understanding Igbo history because it means the Igbo experience doesn't fit neatly into the kind of centralized dynastic historical narrative that characterizes many other African societies studied by historians, and that distinctiveness carries over directly into the genetic record as well. The deepest, most consequential thread running through Igbo genetics involves the Y chromosome, the genetic marker passed down directly from father to son across generations, functioning essentially as a biological surname, connecting a man today to a specific ancestral paternal lineage stretching back through deep time. Multiple peer-reviewed genetic studies have consistently found that the dominant Y chromosome haplogroup among Igbo populations is EM2, sometimes labeled in earlier research as E1B10Y1M2, a lineage that shows up at remarkably high frequency, not just among the Igbo specifically, but broadly across populations speaking Niger-Congo languages throughout West and Central Africa. Research conducted as part of the African Genome Variation Project has dated the emergence of this specific haplogroup lineage to roughly 3,900 to 300 years ago, placing its origin deep within the broader story of early human population expansion across the African continent, tens of thousands of years before anything resembling the historical Near East, ancient Israel, or the civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt had even begun to take shape. This finding carries real significance because it directly addresses, using hard genetic evidence rather than oral tradition or surface-level cultural comparison, the specific question of whether Igbo ancestry traces back to a relatively recent migration from outside Africa. It does not. The EM2 haplogroup's presence at such high frequency and its deep evolutionary age points toward a population that has been established in and around its current West African homeland for an extraordinary long stretch of time, considerably longer than any theory proposing a Near Eastern origin would require. Genetic studies examining broader African population structure have also found that Igbo populations, alongside neighboring groups like the Yoruba, cluster most closely and most consistently with other Niger-Congo speaking populations across the wider region, a pattern that lines up precisely with linguistic classification. Igbo belongs to the Niger-Congo language family, one of the largest language families in the world by number of speakers, And the genetic clustering researchers have documented tracks remarkably well with this linguistic grouping, reinforcing the picture of a population whose ancestry developed largely in place, alongside closely related neighboring groups, rather than arriving as outsiders from a genetically and linguistically distinct region entirely. A particularly detailed and genuinely fascinating piece of research on this specific question was published in the journal Scientific Reports in 2024, examining genetic data collected from three major Nigerian ethnic groups, the Hausa, the Yoruba, and the Igbo, using both mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal ancestry, and Y chromosome markers, which trace paternal ancestry, allowing researchers to compare these two separate genetic threads directly against each other within the same populations. What the research team found was a genuinely striking asymmetry between how maternal and paternal ancestry patterns actually behaved across these three groups. On the maternal side, tracked through mitochondrial DNA, all three populations, Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo, showed a broadly similar genetic substrate, without sharp, clearly defined boundaries separating one group's maternal ancestry from another's. The paternal side of the picture, tracked through Y chromosome data, told a considerably different and more genetically distinct story. The two Niger-Congo speaking groups in the study, the Yoruba and the Igbo, showed strong paternal genetic correlation specifically with other populations sharing that same Niger-Congo linguistic affiliation. The Hausa, by contrast, whose language belongs to the entirely separate Afro-Asiatic language family rather than Niger-Congo, showed paternal genetic ancestry considerably closer to other Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations, alongside a notably higher overall diversity of paternal lineages drawn from across the wider African continent, a pattern broadly consistent with Hausa history and known historical connections to trans-Saharan trade networks and broader movements across the Sahel. The researchers behind this study connected this specific paternal versus maternal asymmetry directly to patriarchality, a social and cultural practice common across many traditional Nigerian societies, including the Igbo, in which women historically moved to join their husband's community upon marriage rather than the reverse. Under this kind of sustained cultural practice, maintained consistently across many generations, maternal lineages naturally end up moving and mixing more freely between different communities over time, while paternal lineages remain considerably more geographically and ethnolinguistically stable, tied more tightly to a specific ancestral homeland and its immediate neighbors. This is precisely the pattern the genetic data reveals, and it represents a genuinely elegant example of how a specific, well-documented cultural practice can leave a clear, measurable, and scientifically detectable fingerprint directly within a population's genome, observable many generations after the fact. Separate genetic research examining Y chromosome and autosomal short tandem repeat markers among Igbo individuals specifically has consistently confirmed the same underlying pattern, finding Igbo paternal lineages assigned to the E1b1a haplogroup with extremely high statistical confidence, further reinforcing just how consistent and well-established this specific genetic signature is across the wider Igbo population as a whole, rather than representing some isolated or unusual finding limited to a single small study sample. Beyond the Y chromosome and mitochondrial evidence specifically, broader genomic research examining sub-Saharan African population history more generally has identified something else genuinely remarkable running throughout much of West Africa, including populations closely related to the Igbo. Research published by Schlebusch and colleagues found that certain West African populations carry a measurable genetic contribution described as prehistoric basal human admixture, an ancient genetic component connecting modern West African populations back to some of the very earliest branches of the modern human family tree. branches that split off from the rest of humanity extraordinarily early in the deep evolutionary history of our species. Studies examining related Nigerian populations have found this kind of basal ancestry present at meaningful levels, roughly around 30% in some Yoruba samples specifically, and while direct Igbo-specific figures for this exact measurement remain an active and ongoing area of research, the broader regional pattern strongly reinforces the same underlying conclusion drawn from the Y chromosome data. West African populations in this specific region, including the Igbo, carry genuinely deep, ancient roots reaching back into some of the earliest chapters of human genetic history anywhere on the planet, rather than reflecting a comparatively recent population arriving from elsewhere. This body of genetic evidence connects directly and meaningfully to the archaeological record documented specifically in Igbo land, which independently supports the same broader picture of deep, long-term continuous indigenous habitation. At a site called Ugwele, located near Uturu in present-day Abia State, archaeologists have recovered stone tools dating to the Middle Stone Age, generally placed within a range extending from roughly 8,000 to 3,000 BCE, providing physical independent evidence of sustained human activity in this specific region stretching back many thousands of years before any written historical record exists anywhere in West Africa. Considerably later, but still remarkably ancient by any reasonable historical standard, the archaeological site of Igbo Ukwu, located in present-day Anambra State, has produced some of the most sophisticated and historically significant bronze artifacts ever recovered anywhere in West Africa, dated to roughly the 9th century CE. These bronzes, created using a genuinely advanced lost wax casting technique, demonstrate a level of metallurgical skill and artistic sophistication that firmly establishes Igbo civilization as one of the more materially and technologically advanced societies operating in the wider West African region during this specific historical period, centuries before many other comparably significant African kingdoms had reached a similar level of artistic and technical development. This same general era also connects directly to the emergence of the Kingdom of Nuri, generally considered by historians to represent the cradle of organized Igbo civilization, tracing its origins back to approximately the 9th century CE and continuing in various forms all the way through to the early 20th century, formally ending only in 1911 under British colonial pressure. What makes the Kingdom of Nuri particularly distinctive among African historical polities and genuinely worth highlighting directly is that its influence and authority across Igboland was established and maintained almost entirely through religious, spiritual, and cultural means rather than through military conquest or armed expansion. Inuri's authority derived from its recognized ritual and spiritual significance within the broader Igbo cosmological system rather than from raw military or economic coercion, a genuinely distinctive model of regional influence compared to many neighboring West African kingdoms of the same general era, which more commonly expanded their authority through direct military conquest and tributary relationships enforced by armed force. It's worth addressing directly, and honestly, the specific belief mentioned at the outset, the idea held by some within Igbo communities and the wider Igbo diaspora that the Igbo people descend directly from an ancient Israelite or Hebrew population. This belief is genuinely real and has circulated for generations, reinforced by certain cultural and religious practices among some Igbo communities that bear surface-level resemblance to elements of ancient Israelite tradition, including specific dietary customs and particular naming conventions. There are also real, documented modern Igbo Jewish communities practicing Judaism today, a genuine and legitimate contemporary religious movement worth acknowledging directly and respectfully. What the actual genetic evidence does not support, however, is the claim that this connection reflects direct biological descent from an ancient Israelite population migrating into West Africa. The dominant Y chromosome haplogroup found among Igbo populations, EM2, is a deeply African lineage with an estimated age of roughly 39,300 years, and it shows a consistent, well-documented pattern of clustering closely with other Niger-Congo speaking populations across West and Central Africa, rather than showing any genetic connection specifically pointing toward the ancient Near East or the historical population of ancient Israel. This is a case where a genuine, sincerely held cultural and religious identity exists entirely, independently of what the underlying genetic evidence actually demonstrates, and it's worth treating both facts honestly and separately, rather than conflating sincere religious identity with a genetic origin claim the current scientific evidence does not actually support. What the genetic evidence does support, and what deserves genuine attention and respect in its own right, is a population history considerably more remarkable than a relatively recent migration story from anywhere outside Africa. The Igbo represent one of the deepest, most continuously documented indigenous population lineages found anywhere in West Africa, with a Y chromosome lineage stretching back nearly 40,000 years, genetic clustering that aligns closely and consistently with the broader Niger-Congo linguistic family stretching across an enormous portion of the African continent, and an independently verified archaeological record demonstrating sophisticated, technologically advanced civilization developing in place across many centuries, well before recorded contact with the outside world. This is not the story of a wandering people who arrived from elsewhere and eventually settled in West Africa. It's the story of one of the oldest continuously rooted populations documented anywhere on Earth, one whose deep genetic history considerably predates not just the ancient Israelite kingdoms of the biblical Near East, but the civilizations of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia as well, stretching back instead into some of the very earliest chapters of the modern human story itself, unfolding entirely within Africa, long before any of humanity's more widely recognized ancient civilizations had even begun to take shape anywhere else in the world. It's worth being direct about where the current scientific picture still contains genuine, acknowledged gaps, because responsible science communication requires that kind of honesty rather than presenting every question as fully and permanently settled. African populations generally, including Nigerian ethnic groups specifically, remain significantly underrepresented within global genetic research databases compared to European and East Asian populations, a well-documented and frequently acknowledged limitation within the broader field of population genetics. Researchers studying Nigerian population genetics have explicitly and repeatedly called for considerably more extensive sampling across the country's many distinct ethnic groups in order to build a fuller, more precise, and more statistically robust picture of the genetic relationships and population history connecting the Igbo, Yoruba, Hausa, and dozens of other ethnic communities within Nigeria's borders. The 2024 scientific report study examining patriarchality's genetic fingerprint specifically noted this same limitation directly, while still managing to draw genuinely meaningful, statistically significant conclusions from the data that was actually available to the research team at the time of publication. There's also a broader, important distinction worth drawing clearly between commercial consumer DNA ancestry testing services, the kind widely marketed directly to individual consumers seeking simple percentage breakdowns of their personal ethnic ancestry, and the kind of rigorous, peer-reviewed academic population genetics research this entire discussion has actually been built on. Researchers and analysts who have carefully examined large samples of commercial ancestry test results specifically from Nigerian individuals have found that meaningfully distinguishing between closely related ethnic groups within Nigeria, Igbo, Yoruba, and Hausa Fulani specifically, using currently available consumer-grade DNA testing technology alone, remains considerably more difficult. and less definitively reliable than popular marketing for these specific commercial products often implies to the average customer. Real, meaningful ethnic-level distinction within Nigeria, as this discussion has laid out directly, generally requires the kind of detailed, carefully controlled academic research combining Y chromosome data, mitochondrial DNA data, and broader autosomal genetic analysis together, rather than relying on the simpler, more generalized regional ancestry percentage estimates that most standard consumer DNA testing products are currently designed and able to reliably provide to individual customers. Put all of this together, and here is what the actual current scientific evidence genuinely supports regarding Igbo genetic origins. The Igbo people carry a dominant paternal genetic lineage, haplogroup EM2, with an estimated evolutionary age of approximately 39,300 years, a lineage found broadly and consistently across Niger-Congo speaking populations throughout West and Central Africa. Genetic clustering analysis consistently places Igbo ancestry closest to other Niger-Congo speaking neighbors, a pattern that lines up precisely with established linguistic classification and reinforces the picture of a population whose ancestry developed largely in place across an extraordinarily long span of time. Detailed comparative research examining both maternal and paternal genetic lineages has revealed a genuinely elegant example of how sustained cultural practices, specifically patrilical marriage traditions maintained across many generations, can leave a clear, measurable, scientifically detectable signature directly within a population's genetic structure. And independent archaeological evidence recovered directly from Igbo land itself, stretching from Middle Stone Age tools at Uguele through the sophisticated 9th century bronze work discovered at Igbo Ukwu, and the subsequent rise of the religiously governed Kingdom of Nri, provides physical, independently verified confirmation of the same underlying story the genetic evidence tells on its own. The Igbo people were never wandering outsiders who eventually settled into West Africa from somewhere else entirely. The evidence, genetic and archaeological alike, consistently points toward something considerably deeper and more remarkable, one of the most continuously documented, deeply rooted indigenous populations, found anywhere on the African continent, with genetic roots reaching back tens of thousands of years before any of the ancient civilizations more commonly discussed in world history had even begun to take shape anywhere else on Earth.